Welcome, everyone. Today, we're continuing our conversation about the future of leadership in ag retail. In our last session, Aaron Locker walked us through the shifting talent landscape and why emotionally intelligent, adaptable leaders will be essential for the next decade. That discussion naturally led to an important follow-up question: how do organizations actually prepare for leadership transitions? That's the focus of today's conversation: practical, real-world succession planning. My name is Hunter Carpenter, Senior Director of Government Affairs for ARA, and I'll introduce our webinar speakers in just a bit. First, I want to go over a few housekeeping items so you know what to expect. Let me first remind everyone that webinars are an important part of the ARA professional development pathway and provide a great opportunity for ARA member companies to help educate their employees. Today's webinar will be recorded and added to the member-only ARA dashboard section of our website. And as a reminder, you can log into the member-only ARA dashboard to access past webinar recordings at any time. If you do not have an ARA login, you can email info@aradc.org to set one up. And questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation, but you can type them into the chat panel at any time. That said, I'm pleased to introduce today's speakers. We're joined again by Aaron Locker, Managing Director at Kincannon & Reed. We're also thrilled to welcome Sally Day, Managing Director at Kincannon & Reed and the leader of K&R Edge, Leadership Solutions for Food and Ag. Sally's work centers on executive coaching, succession planning, leadership assessments, and CEO performance reviews across the food and ag value chain. Rather than a presentation with slides, today will be more of a conversation. It'll be a chance to go deeper, explore the why behind succession challenges, and talk about what readiness really looks like in ag retail. Please feel free to add your questions to the discussion. Our goal is to make this session insightful and practical for you. With that, I'll pass it to Sally and Aaron to introduce themselves briefly, then we'll dive right in. Sally?
Sure. So thank you, Hunter. It's great to be with you today. And for those that I don't know on the call, I'm Sally Day. As Hunter mentioned, I lead K&R Edge Leadership Solutions for Food and Ag. I happen to be sitting in Northeast Ohio. You probably know that Kincannon & Reed. We are a global firm and we are all over. So I happen to be in the Midwest. I am a certified executive coach. I hold a couple of different credentials. The one that I'll mention is with a PCC, with the International Coaching Federation, and I'm also a Gestalt trained coach. So, as Hunter mentioned, I specialize in working with CEOs and boards and senior leaders across the food value chain. So, yes, in agriculture, but actually, I do quite a bit of work even downstream towards the consumer. Before joining Kincannon & Reed, I spent more than 2 decades in food CPG. So I worked for organizations, some really big ones, Nestle, Unilever, and as you could appreciate, I've been bought and sold so many times in many different acquisitions and mergers and divested. But I've also held executive roles in procurement, supply chain, and organization development. So one of my key employers right down the road from me here is J.M. Smucker Company, and I led their enterprise-wide leadership and organization development group. So really, my experience is a blend of what I would call operational experience in food CPG, plus years of leadership development and executive coaching. And this very much does shape my view of when I am working with clients today. So the main goal for my role within Kincannon & Reed is that just to help organizations really focus on leadership continuity. So much of my work centers on helping teams navigate the change, helping clarify expectations, working with senior leaders of how to think about their succession. And so I'm passionate about this work. Food and ag people are a delight to work with. I find them humble and without ego, and they're always trying to do the right thing. So I'm really excited to be a part of the conversation today. Aaron, I'll throw it to you.
Yeah, it's good to be with everybody again. As Hunter mentioned, last time we kind of framed up, just the talent landscape, and so I'm excited to be here with Sally. Again, with Kincannon & Reed, I'm managing director based out of Delaware. And before that, I've spent the last 30 years in the crop input space, specifically crop protection with Syngenta, FMC, and Helm Agro. And so I work with Sally. I do specifically around the executive search side, but then we tend at Kincannon Reed go end to end from searching for the right talent for clients all the way to then helping them to develop that talent for the long term. So it's been good to work with Sally, and I'm glad Sally had a chance to join us here today as we continue to dig deeper into not only what the talent landscape is, but what can ag retailers do, or what do they need to be thinking about as they look at their next, 2 to 3 to 5 year plans, and as it relates to talent?
Mhm.
Great. Well, thanks again for being here. And as we said, this is going to feel like more of a conversation, but we want you to type in questions as they pop into your head, and hopefully that'll help spur discussion as we conclude later today. But the first question I have, and feel free, you can both answer or jump in if one of you wants to take it, is why does succession planning feel like such a difficult and delayed conversation in ag retail?
Yeah, you know what, and I'll start, and Aaron, if you want to jump in, this is a really good place to start. It's really because most organizations and associations I work with always ask the same question. And having been doing this work for several years, succession planning is difficult because it's not just a business decision. We all know how to make a decision, solve a problem, do a situation analysis, but this one is really quite an emotional one, especially in agriculture. So what I would say is that many leaders in ag retail, they didn't just step into a job. They actually built something. They shaped it, right? They've weathered the storm. They've made sacrifices. They poured their identity into their business. So in a way, I feel like succession, it just talking about the ending or what's next and talking about who's replacing you, it feels a bit uncomfortable. So I think that is why it is difficult. And I think delaying it doesn't really protect anyone. It actually probably creates more pressure and it limits options just think about it, right? An emergency happens and someone's out without really thinking about that emergency replacement, you have less options. So there's quite a bit at stake in these conversations. And in my opinion, what I'm observing is they're not happening early enough.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Sally. And I think as I see many organizations, ag retail, and really across the ag sector, it's things that we know we have to do. We know, as I talked about in the last session, we're setting a record for the number of people turning 65 globally. And so we know many senior leaders are going to be, retiring over the next several years. And it's one of those things where you need to do it, but then I don't see a lot of organizations really robustly lean in and make this part of the strategy on how they navigate through that over the next several years. And I think it seems like a lot of it when you talk about people that have succession plans, it's you peel that onion back and it's kind of, well, I know if I get hit by a bus tomorrow, who I have selected to take my role. But the question that remains is, but how are you developing that person so that they can step in? And I think that's really what succession planning, is all about.
You've talked a little bit about what's at stake when these conversations are delayed, but what are the challenges or blind spots that you see most often in this work?
Yeah, I would say, Hunter, that I see honestly three big forces at play here. And I actually think Aaron just referenced it and talked about it in your last presentation, is really the leadership transition wave that's before us. I know we sometimes call it the leadership cliff, with the aging population, retirements, generational shift, consolidation. That in addition to increasing complexity. So, think about it, your space, regulations, sustainability, technology, labor shortages or labor shifts. It just makes the job harder and harder. And it's hard to imagine what the next leader is going to be having to facing with, which leads me to the third shift, which is like the changing and shifting expectations of what we need from leaders. And exposing them to different parts of the business is so key. So I think that's why succession isn't just about who's next, it's really about who's ready to be next. And what's at stake is quite a bit because you lose control, you're not as prepared. And no one wants to be in that moment where you have to have the emergency meeting and decide, okay, let's plug this hole. What are we going to do?
Are there any early warning signs that folks should be looking for to indicate that a company is falling behind on succession planning or haven't put together this plan correctly?
Yeah, I'll quote the folks that at SHRM, which is the Society for HR Management. There is boards. I think the number is about 20% actually have documented succession plan. And I would say there's a few patterns that show up in the organizations, no matter what the size, okay? Um, what I would call this emotional bond or emotional ownership, where the leader is often the company, like they're the long tenured leaders. We all know them. They've been around, right? These giants, they've been around, they're legendary folks. And letting go feels really personal and not necessarily procedural. It's not part of the strategic planning process because the urgent overtakes the strategic all the time. The other thing I would say, the myth of later. Later is just safe. It's like, oh, we can't get to that. We're gonna talk about that. And later, as I mentioned, overcomes urgent and until it becomes a crisis. And then the organization really does lose sort of choice and they lose some degree of control. I would say that there's perhaps sometimes an issue with a narrow leadership bench. So potential successors, maybe they're excellent in their role, but they haven't been given the broader exposure across the business. Sometimes if you're in a certain function, and you're in operations, you've never been in front of a supplier or a client or a customer in a certain way. So, it's limited cross-functional visibility. And the one thing we know is that with all the changes and the pace of which everything is moving so quickly, this broad exposure, there's more expected of leaders today. And so getting them out in terms of greater visibility, I would say is like a pattern that I'm seeing more and more of, and I'm really encouraging it a lot. And a big way to do that is just to build it in expectations into a development plan to say, hey, you've got to, spend some of your time deliberately at, say, a customer or something. The other, I'd say, pattern, I think just there's some degree of silence about development. It's really interesting that emerging leaders want to know what my path is. They want to have a conversation with someone, but yet I feel like sometimes CEOs or board chairs or heads of businesses, particularly even family, they don't want to say, they don't want to voice it. They don't want to say it and rock the boat or, anoint someone and someone else. And what if that plan doesn't really work out? And then the big one, a lack of intentional development. So this is hard and getting harder, I would say, because it's so individualized. And I want to give you an example of this. If you just talk about communication, and it's back in, maybe I'm going to show my age here, Hunter. Back in the old day, right? We used to go to training together and be trained in a particular topic. But now, like, think about the many generations in the workforce. A digital native needs more support in a thing like communication. What they need is about workplace requirements, soft skills, etiquette, right? Things, beyond the texting. Well, a senior leader who is working on their communication may need more refinement, more strategic messaging, more influencing. So it's the same skill, but very, very different, which is so hard and why I'm an advocate for intentional development, but you have to really think of it much more on an individual basis, where it's not like you go to training, you get dunked, and then you go back. Does that make sense, Hunter? Yeah.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
I,
And I would even add on to that, Hunter, your question as far as, companies falling behind. I attended the Crop Life conference here about a month or so ago. and talk with a lot of industry leaders in the crop protection side of the business. It seemed like the general theme was right now we feel fairly decent about our senior leadership team. Granted, there's going to be retirements we're going to have to deal with, but we feel we've got a strong leadership team. We feel like we have a strong bench. But what was giving everybody heartburn was we don't necessarily are not as comfortable that we think that bench could automatically step up into that senior leader role. And so that's why I said earlier, when companies are thinking about this and they know that the challenges that's facing them, it's a matter of, like Sally said, now what are you going to do about it, right? And development and succession planning, which I really join hand in hand, is so critical.
And Aaron, do you see these same succession challenges in ag retail that you see on the manufacturing or supplier side?
Yeah, I mean, without a doubt. I mean, let's face it, ag retail is unique, right? Many of the most capable leaders have come up through operations, agronomy, sales. They literally built the organization, with their own hands, right? And now find themselves leading organizations that must transition leadership, just as the complexity of the role has never been greater. And, the tension is really exactly the reason why we're here today. Case in point, and I think probably all of us have heard stories like this, the retailer with 4 locations that lost a branch manager unexpectedly. As Sally alluded, the CEO nearing retirement that is reluctant, to do that transition, planning, a high performer that, too quickly without leadership readiness got moved up into a leadership position, or what we always used to say, your top salespeople aren't necessarily your top managers, right? So it's got to be a lot more intentional than that. But I think there's a lot of, and even some, that we've heard of, that the manager leaves and takes the entire staff to a competitor. All those, I think all of us have seen those examples. And again, it gets back into, and Sally talked about it, for that, for the employees of ag retail, just like any business, what is my path? Where am I going? What's my future look like? And, which again, that succession planning along with the development plan helps that stickiness, if you will, of not only maintaining it and keeping your high performers, but then also everybody is much more committed to the organization because they see that path forward for themselves.
Yeah, I want to move a little bit more into strategy here, and ask, what, in your experience, what do you see as effective succession strategy? What does that look like?
Yeah, I would say I'll start with what I think are 4 things. And Aaron, if you want to jump in on this one too, I welcome it. I would say succession is a process, not a document. So when we put it as part of our overall planning, whether you call it strategic planning, annual planning, I'm less concerned about words, right? But it's really a process, and not just you document it, put it away, and you never look at it again. It's not a binder on the shelf. It's an ongoing conversation about talent, about readiness, about, being intentional about exposing the next level to the things that they need to take over the role. I would say definitely identify key roles early. Okay. And not just the CEO, but think about the operational, customer facing, mission critical roles is really important. I would say build options, not just one single successor or a single heir, if you will, instead of like just grooming one person. Develop several leaders who could step in, and depending on the moment and the strategy and the future direction, that would serve you well. And then integrate what I call leadership development activities into the business. So it's really about building the capability here, giving the emerging leaders exposure, mentorship, and coaching. So like my favorite phrase is leadership development is succession planning, because it starts early, and it's My opinion, depending on the size of your organization, 36 months is not too early. When you really think about what it takes to for that leader to put in place or do something, say they want to do executive coaching, or just, or be exposed to different parts or a different role, right? A different seat on the bus. That to get a really good experience and to live with the results of your decision, I mean, that in and of itself probably takes 12 to 18 months. Think about the big cycles here. So I would say start early, and the earlier the better. Erin, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, no, I think the same thing. I mean, I coach a lot of our clients on, Sally alluded to it. It does start with the planning process, the strategic planning process that I call it anyhow, because I see that many times is that companies will have their 3-year, 5-year, strategic plan. They come out of there with, the objectives and the strategies to achieve the objectives and the tactics and everything else. They feel really good. But what many of them fail to do is ask the next question, what type of talent or skill set are we going to need to realize those plans? And also at the same time, what's the risk to the business within those plans? One of those risks that we're talking about today is, okay, what happens when Bob retires in the next 2 years? How are we going to fill that? And so, that's where it starts. And then that forces you into that conversation about, okay, how do we step up, this next generation of leadership? And if we are going, and let's say, for example, in the next 2 years, we're going to need to have a new agronomy manager for the business. Yes, we have some very capable field sales agronomists, out in the field, that are agronomically sound. But from a business standpoint, we're going to need to do X, Y, and Z. And as Sally said, starting early, is critical because somebody just can't, it's one thing to learn some of the things that they're going to have to be doing, but to really, I guess what I would call adapt that skill and have it as a part of, what they do and have that experience behind them, that takes time. And so the earlier, as Sally said, the earlier you can do that, the better.
And I would say this also, like using this imagination, because it's not a clone of yourself. Like I know one of my first CEO succession projects I worked in ag was, the CEO said, I need the next me. And I really had to do a bit pushback. Do we really need the next you? Because you've been at the helm for, I think he was there like 22 years. The next, right, a different leader for a different time. When you really think about what the expectation is, the pace of business, it's really a much more challenging environment, right? I hate to say that to someone who feels like they've weathered the storm, but I really challenge them to say, do you need the next you, or how do we imagine that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's how's the business changing?
Yeah,
We're all trying to stay ahead of, the changing needs. What is the
yeah.
grower of tomorrow going to need, and how do we fill that need? And so you're right, the business is changing. We need to adapt, to that. And in many cases, it's going to require, different skill sets, more digital based, more, technology based, things like that.
Yeah.
The ag retail landscape is always changing, whether it's consolidation or different regional needs. I do want to ask a question about smaller family-owned ag retailers. How do they begin the succession planning strategy without feeling overwhelmed?
Yeah. My advice is always to start small and start with something that's actual real. Okay. So let me kind of add more context to that. Like just pick one critical role and ask yourself, if this role opened tomorrow, what would break? And that's where you should start. And I think defining what ready looks like, and I don't mean like a job description, but I mean like what are the capabilities now for this next chapter? I know we're all dealing with AI and the impact that it has on all of our roles across just all industries, professions, and organizations. But you have to use some imagination here and really think about what ready looks like. I would share giving emerging leaders some visibility, maybe, letting them sit in on key meetings, right? Giving them cross-functional project or something to go own or lead a piece of the business, I think would be really important, and particularly in family run or small. And I would also share, as an executive coach, assessments. The assessments are a particular instrument, if you will, that coaches and leadership development people use. And what that does is it sparks sort of development, if you will. It drives through real data. Sometimes they're, Hunter, they're like personality, or they can be about emotional intelligence. We have Hogan does a great leadership assessment, and it really helps the leader see their strengths, their gaps, their potential, gets the ball rolling. And imagine in a family business or in a small business, having your leadership really invest in you. Have your leaders invest in you by saying, "Hey, we want to buy you a couple of sessions with a coach. We want to do this assessment. We want to give you some information beyond. We want you to see a 360 and get feedback on how you're doing, because feedback really is a gift." And then I would say, if you're small, maybe get outside your belly button, right? Get an outside perspective here. Not necessarily to take over the process, but really to add some structure, objectivity, and some ideas, right? Family owned or founder led ag businesses. A neutral facilitator really, really goes a long way, and it helps smooth out what I talked about in your first question, which was around that this is emotional, right? It's not just a business problem that we have to solve. It's really quite emotional.
Trying to think of a good way to say this. How does early succession change your ability to recruit candidates in the market?
Yeah, I can take that. Yeah, I think from what I've seen, Hunter, um, you know, if done right, as Sally talked about, succession planning turns into a development discussion, turns into hey, I'm developing our people. And I think in ag, I see it across the sector. I mean, genuinely, that's what we want to do. We want to develop people. I mean, we're growing food, and it's the same thing about the people side of it too. Um, and when we do that, and when we have that plan, and we know, kind of like what Sally said, what's going to break, and what are our major gaps that we're going to have to fill, and then we have those discussions with those younger folks in our organizations. One of the key questions is, kind of in the performance review, timing, if you will, it should be a back and forth. What is it that you want to do in your career? And then for those folks that say, yeah, I'd like to progress, I'd like to have, I'd like to lead people and things like that. Now you can really start to say, okay, what is it about that individual that we can develop? How that plays it. So now you've integrated into what you do, you've integrated it, it's part of now your culture, and that's where it gets into recruitment. Because let's face it, we all live it's a small industry. And in many cases, obviously, ag retail, they're in small communities, and word gets around. And so when retailers are trying to attract, new talent, one of the first things they're going to do is ask people that work there, "Hey, tell me about that. Tell me about what they do." And what a retailer or any organization wants is, the best case scenario is they say, "Hey, so and so, this company really puts a lot of emphasis on people development. I feel like I've got a career here. I've got a path here. Let me share with you some of the things that they've done. They got me an executive coach, or they've done, whatever it is." That's really where it gets into recruitment, because it becomes now part of your employee value proposition. And I coach clients a lot about that. Is really, it's going to be tougher and tougher to attract talent, as I shared on the last call. And so you really got to bone up on what's my employee value proposition, my elevator speech, if you will, on why it is that I'm trying to get this person to come to work for me.
Yeah, if I can also jump in here,
Sure.
Hunter, is uh, there's also, I think it could be very difficult for founder-led or family businesses when there is not a family member who can take the who can take the business. I think this is a reality because maybe folks, are not, they went to the big city, they went to DC. That this is a reality. Having that conversation and acknowledging, because maybe your succession plan, you don't have one in the organization, but you have to kind of start to prepare yourself that you're going to go outside your organization to do an external hire, right? This is where you jump over to the Aaron side of the house in terms of search. But I, I'm sensitive to that too, because I think there are probably a fair amount of family-led business, and I work in a lot of agricultural businesses where there isn't the family member, the trusted, son or daughter, or who can take over the business.
Yeah, that's a great point, Sally. I was at the Western Seeds Association meeting last month, and there it was probably the single biggest event that I've ever seen, true generational transition at its best and worst.
Yeah.
I talked to organizations, family-owned, businesses that were being very thoughtful, in saying, "Look, I'm going to be transitioning this to my son or my nephew or my daughter, but I want them to figure out, and work with them so that they can kind of figure out what a CEO actually is. They've seen me in the business, but I need to make them, a CEO. So what can you do to help us out there to get them ready?" That was what I would call more intentional. All the way to the other side, where I'm sitting with the sons, and the parents just basically said, "Here you go," kind of a sink or swim, type thing. And they're like, "Wow, I mean, I've worked in the business, but I haven't led the business." And so that's just kind of two ends of the spectrum of what I see, companies, many cases on both sides.
Yeah. And it also makes me think about the fact that in particularly family businesses, there's not alignment and agreement on successors. And what do we do really well? We avoid difficult, what feels confrontational conversations, right? And I really want to encourage people to have the conversations in a way that exposes it and works it. This is why I think a lot of folks use a third party neutral facilitator to have that conversation. How do we come to terms with that? Let's talk through why we don't have alignment here, because it's real, right? Like it is so real.
And you can take a lot of that emotion out by doing what Sally had suggested earlier. If we look at a role, that critical role, and we look at it through the lens of, let's say, 3 years from now, and we say, what are the skill sets? What's that person going to need to be proficient at? In my mind, what I've seen is that takes some of the emotion out of it, because you start to see even people that maybe have two people vying for that role, let's say, for example, but knowing now what that role really entails and being clear about that, you can start to see, well, yeah, maybe I tend to spend most of my time over here, or I'm really want to lean into this part of it. And so between that and then also coming in with a, like Sally said, independent, say, leadership team assessment that said, well, here's what the role requires, here's where we're at now. And it's all good, right? None of us are perfect. And so we all know we need to, improve on some areas, but it really focuses in on what are the areas that we need to work on. And then that, again, gets back into your development.
Yeah, and in my experience with ag, I think there's a question also of how much professionalism do we do and when do we need it? and I use this word professionalism, right? Particularly maybe in some family-owned businesses or even founder-led ag businesses, that how do we professionalize in a way that is right for our culture and keeps pace?
What mindset shifts help leaders create healthier transitions?
I would say the biggest shift uh, in succession is really thinking about that this is about legacy and not loss. When you move from who will replace me to how do I ensure what I've built continues, there's a nice little shift that goes on. And I think that's an important way, a good lens of which to look at it. Because letting go is leadership. Healthy transitions are strong leadership. It's not diminished leadership. So developing others strengthens, yes, the whole organization for today. It helps employees feel more secure. Aaron said, it drives engagement, drives retention, boards feel more confident, customers feel more trust. So it has immense sort of sprawl, if you will. Um, and I would say this ties back probably to Aaron's previous presentation around emotionally intelligent leaders. They just create smoother handoffs. It's easier for them. So in ag retail, so much of this is built on relationships, and relationships require a certain amount of sort of emotional composure, empathy, and presence. And so with every successful transition, the outgoing leader's focus wasn't on themselves. I've worked with many CEOs are completely enlightened about all this. Some are, scared of the pace of change and AI and all the, regulate all kinds of things, right? But really creating the conditions for the next person to be successful. That's kind of how they think about it, and I think that really helps.
Yeah, I always kind of phrase it people that I'm working with, like succession, we shouldn't think about succession as it's just about replacing a person. It really is about protecting the business.
Mhm.
And especially, Sally said, especially family-owned businesses that many retailers are, that's protecting legacy.
Mhm. Yeah.
If someone listening today could take one practical next step, where should they start?
Mhm. I I guess I would say know your critical role. If it's the CEO, fine, or the president or the head of the business, that's fine. But there are oftentimes roles that have an outsized impact on the business. So just asking yourself the simple question, what's our readiness story around a critical role? And if that answer is unclear, then I think you know where you should start. And I think that's really, it's something that anyone on this call could be thinking about immediately. What's our readiness story for that one critical role? Because as I say, succession planning is not just a luxury, it's actually stewardship. And I know that it feels like in agriculture, we often talk about leaving the land better than when we found it. And this is really the same sort of translation, the same sort of theme, if you will. Succession is no different than that. It's one of the most important acts that a leader can do. And, in terms of protecting future, yes, risk mitigator, but also in terms of leaving the organization in a better place than when you found it. Aaron, thoughts on that?
Yeah, yeah, I think you're spot on. I think, where do we start? It's those critical roles. I mean, you got to ask yourself, if my let's say my top two leaders left tomorrow, who steps in and are they ready? you know, and take some time to really think about that. And back to your point, if I list here's my critical roles. Now, granted, we feel like everything to run a business, they're all critical, but then again, it's like if that person leaves tomorrow, which one of those roles, if the person leaves tomorrow, is, as Sally mentioned earlier, something's going to break. So now I've got my list. Then the next thing is, once you have that list, then step two would be normally is what it is about those roles and how are those roles going to change, and how can I articulate what that role is going to need to look like. So I'm not just hiring for today, or getting somebody ready for today's business. I know that I need to get them ready for this business, what it's going to look like in 3 or 5 years. And so, I mean, those are probably the two biggest things, to start with. And then as Sally alluded to, sometimes, depending on the size and scope of the business, the roles that we need to really hone in on. You all know the business better than anybody. In some cases, whether it's to take and you could do those yourselves, just taking those couple of steps. In some cases, maybe again, there's emotions involved. There's a lot of balls in the air. There's a lot of options. There's a lot more things to deal with. That's where it makes sense to maybe bring in somebody external that can be that independent voice and help you walk through that. And at the same time, what I see many cases happens is the organization looks at that as that's another example of this company investing in us, because if you position that correctly.
It reminds me of a story of when I was brought in on a succession plan. It was interesting because they had some people on the senior leadership team that didn't have visibility. So I'm talking like the board now, right? The board saw a senior leader once a quarter when they maybe came in to present, and they didn't have any familiarity. And so opening up that visibility can really be, in this case, when they started to open up the visibility to this successor, and they started to expose, I think she was leading like a different project. They were like, oh, now we can see her as a succession. But in some cases, I think people are moving so quickly and they're so structured, right? A board meeting here, maybe I'll have a dinner with the board member, but there's not the broad exposure to them. I think that can help. So depending on the size of the organization, obviously, Hunter, if in really large organizations, some people just don't get seen, don't get the visibility with the right people. So I would also ask myself that question: is there talent in this organization that we're not seeing? Because maybe they're just so good at their job, right? They kind of, the curse of competency, they come in, they sweep in, they do a good job, they do a report out, and then they're gone. And people don't see them in a different lens and say, oh, well, she could actually be more. And it actually happened in this particular case.
Well, look, if folks want to ask questions, please feel free to jump in the chat. I'm going to kick it off because I have a question, and this might be a little bit of a curveball. In the ag retail space, a lot of our businesses rely upon a consistent generation, sometimes generation over generation customer base. Their growers stick with them because they are their trusted advisor. Their father or grandfather or someone in their family might have used that same retailer for their crop inputs. When you're putting together a plan for succession, how do you take into account your customer base and wanting to retain those folks that depend on your business?
Oh,
Yeah. I'll go ahead, Sally.
well, I was only going to say this because I really had this situation, and so it's just such a really good question, Hunter. So, from a process point of view, when I'm facilitating a succession plan, in this case, I'm thinking about a CEO. The attributes that was really important for not that CEO's role, but he helped influence me to and articulate what are the things, the 3 to 5, call it, most important criteria or job responsibilities that the next CEO is going to need to have. What are those attributes? And in this case, it was about the customer base. It was about longevity, and we created we did evaluate the successor, and the successor was missing that. They just didn't have that role. They were not, they're, just maybe a little more hidden, but they didn't have the role. So when we ended up making a development plan for the successor, and the successor was communicated, first off, asked, what are your aspirations? Would you like to become the next leader? They did. Then we were able to do some very intentional, doesn't cost a lot of money, some things to expose that individual to the customer base, so that whether they were going with the sales leaders out, but really exposing them to that part of the business. And it was so important. So I would say, your question is, I'm answering it from a process point of view, but I understand there's so much context and sensitivity around it. But I've actually had this situation.
Yeah, and there was an example that and some recent conversations that I had about this specific thing, where again, I think it was one of the examples that I quoted earlier, the the owners, are transitioning it over to the next generation. And so obviously started asking them questions about, what's the business going to look like and things like that. But it was very quickly, as Sally alluded to, you could coach people up on business things. In many cases, they've been involved in the business in different capacities. So they kind of understand that. Yeah, they need to get maybe more better financial acumen because now they're going to be running the business. But the biggest thing that is going to happen is when when the owner of that business that's been that for many years leaves, the customer relationships are the biggest gap, early on. Again, which then gets back to, so knowing that, we best be doing all we can as part of their development to not only talk about the financial development and business acumen development standpoint, but also take into account the relationships and even the multi-generational relationships at growers, right? Because now the dad is turning the farm over to the son or the daughter. And
Mhm.
so, that has to be a key element of that development is you need to build relationships with those people for when I move on.
Yeah, and things like that, when we talk about intentional development, they don't have to cost an arm and a leg. It's not like the Harvard Business, agricultural course that is right. Like these kinds of actions intentionally done, and carving out the time, giving and supporting it doesn't cost that much money.
It's hard to handicap future success when you're talking about succession planning, right? No one has a crystal ball. But when companies are looking to replace leadership, whether it's at the C-suite level or even in their sales, marketing, communications teams, when they're trying to fill roles that are vacant or going to be coming vacant, how do you determine what talents to look for in a potential successor? Is it someone that can provide continuity in that space? Are you looking to try and find someone with talents that closely mirror other leaders within the company so that you help complement other folks? How do you plan for that, or what do you look for as a company that is helping a company fill these roles?
Yeah, when we're working with clients on a search, be it CEO all the way down to, middle management, one of the first things that we do is, as we talk today, is let's understand, what the role is, what the responsibilities, what are the key attributes for a person to be successful, at this role. And not only for today and for now, let's look at it 3 years from now and what changes. So you kind of like the role profile, if you will. Now I know what type of experiences and attributes, things like that I need to look for. To your point, Hunter, and I felt that was pretty insightful, and something that I've done on teams that I've led before. You also want to look across your team, right? And I would always say, use a basketball analogy, we don't need a team of all guards. You know, we need a good mix of, yes, they need to be able to do their individual roles, But then what I've seen most effective is you start looking outside the box a little bit and saying, yeah, can this person do the role? Yes. Now, what else do they bring if I look at it from a team aspect? Because I've got maybe some highly analytical folks on the team. That's great. I've got some people that challenge the process. That's fantastic. I've got some people, and so I challenge people to look what's going to fill your team out in addition to the role. And I think taking that broad look is where we in our case, we coach, a lot of clients on the front end rather than just saying, here's the job description, see what you can find.
Yeah, I would also add to that. I feel like we do a really nice job. Like Aaron and the search folks do a really nice job in discovery with a client where we spend time to understand when you're hiring this role, help me understand, do you see this person as an up and comer or been there, done that person? And are you looking for them to be a successor? And what's the composition of the team? I think, Aaron's talking about the composition of the team. Sometimes you look at an org chart and you don't really have a true appreciation for it. So we ask a lot of questions in order to sort of discover that. And our client will tell us we need these sets of experiences. We want this type of background. But also, they talk about the importance of cultural fit. And we have some wonderful ways in which we assess cultural fit through behavior interviews, but also assessment tools, some of the things I was talking about. So if they're evaluating, say you've got a person who's just a rock star over here in the marketing area, and you think they have further capacity, right? If they're on the staff and you're evaluating them for being CEO, we will help sort of walk them through what are the most important things about that CEO role. But there's definitely the pros and cons of the internal promotion. Again, though, why you might want to be talking to the sales and marketing person 12, 18, 24 months ahead of that CEO leaving, right? Yeah. This stuff is so interesting to me. I always find that, just the team dynamics and how you fit the pieces together as using the analogy of the basketball. You don't want the whole team being guards, but you certainly want a sort of different personalities in that blend, but you do want the team collaboration and spirit and the cultural fit on that for that team. It's so interesting.
Yeah, I think this has given folks on the call a lot to think about, and hopefully, folks that weren't able to join today will be able to watch the recording. So I want to thank you, Sally and Aaron, for sharing such practical and grounded guidance with our members today. Succession planning can feel complex, but you've given us a clear and encouraging path to get started. So thanks to all of you who joined the call today. We hope today's conversation sparks some meaningful dialogue within your own organizations and with your companies. So we hope you have a great rest of your day. And if Sally or Aaron want to close us out with any fleeting thoughts or things we can think about ahead of our next K&R webinar, that'd be great.
Well, there was one quick question I saw, Hunter, that came up in the chat. Should a retailer or employer be considering evaluating two candidates for succession planning at a time in case of heir apparent leaves unexpectedly? And I think, Sally kind of alluded to that. It shouldn't be, kind of a, one for one, right? Because you're trying to do is you're trying to develop your bench, right? And there hopefully, in best case scenario, there could be a couple of people right for that role. So I think developing your bench and keeping that focus on it is critical. The one thing I want to leave everybody with, and I thought was interesting, I mentioned early on, in the C-suite, a lot of retirements. We're setting a record for a number of people turning 65 globally this year. Something I didn't know, and I was the other day, just this week, I was talking to Dr. Jay Ackridge, former dean of the Ag College of Purdue, who did a study for USDA recently. And it was the amount of jobs that are going to be coming into the ag sector between 2025 and 2030, which was 105,000. So for, say, high school, seniors going into college or college folks, that's a good message. The challenge he also found was that only 48% of them are going to come from what we call traditional ag degrees. And the last bit that I thought was really enlightening was he said, actually, we're for 18 to 21-year-olds, that group is peaking this year. So you've got a lot of retirements and you've got fewer young people coming in. The reason why I bring that up, not only for trivia's sake, but no, the reason why I bring that up is because, again, we all think about succession. We all think about, yes, we got to do better. And I would challenge all of us to really get intentional, as we start looking into 2026 and saying, how am I going to incorporate this as part of just what we do as opposed to an event? And again, anything that we can do to help, please feel free to reach out. And then the last thing I'll ask is, as we continue down this series, shoot me a note, Sally, Hunter, on maybe what are some other leadership and talent areas that you'd like to explore a little bit more. And then that'll formulate what we do with webinars throughout the rest of this series.
Great.
That's great. Well, on behalf of Kincannon and Reed and the Agricultural Retailers Association, thanks again to Sally and Aaron for helping us today, and look forward to seeing everyone on the next webinar. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, everybody.